There at the beginning. Okay, so now we're going into our second panel, and I want to say thank you, first of all, to Children Now and to Ted and Eileen and everybody for inviting me to be here, and also to the folks at the Future of Children. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. And the goal for this session is to we had some of the examples of how media, multimedia are being used to educate kids in the first session, and now it's to talk about how do we kind of scale that up, how do we get to that in the real world using media in the best way possible for kids. And I will start off, before I introduce the panelists, by telling you that I stand in front of you as a little bit of a skeptic, and I'm not sure if Eileen was really aware of this when she asked me to moderate this panel. I hope that I am an open-minded skeptic, but because I do so many studies about the role media are already playing in kids' lives, I know how much time they're spending with new media and media technologies and old media already. And so I tend to, my natural instinct is to worry less about how do we make sure there's more media in kids' lives and more parts of their lives, and I worry a little more about how do we create more real-world experiences for kids. So I'm less concerned, this is just my instinct, is a little less concerned with, can we have them do a virtual science experiment, and more, can we get them to be doing hands-on real science experiments, and can we have them sewing and cooking and growing a garden and building a castle in the real world with some materials that they find around the house and not just doing it virtually. So that's just my bias, and I'm here to be kind of dissuaded and challenged and all of that, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion. And why don't we bring the panelists up, and I'll introduce them as they come on up. Sandy Calvert is chair of the Department of Psychology at Georgetown University, and also the co-founder of the Children's Digital Media Center, which is a collaboration across a bunch of universities that's doing some of the most important research about interactive media and young people's learning. Jeanne Elliott is principal of the Bayside S.T.E.M Academy in let's see if we can see what it's saying, hear what it's saying. Okay, and Bayside is a middle school, and we heard from one of their teachers earlier, and it's a collaboration with Stanford University as well, trying to work on some unique curricula, and I think Jeanne's special focus is on professional development, so we'll be looking forward to hearing about that. Krause, in addition to being board member for Children Now, is executive director of the Krause Center for Innovation at Foothill College. And again, the focus of the Krause Center is on professional development activities for teachers for the K to 14 population, and especially with a focus on technology. So we welcome Gay. And finally, Craig Wacker. He's program officer in the Digital Media and Learning program at the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. And as we know, they have been really at the forefront of work on digital media and learning. And Craig's background that he brings to that is a background in policy work on educational policy at the federal government level. So that'll be wonderful insights as well. So what we're going to do is, I think that each of our panelists is going to speak for approximately 8 to 10 minutes, if I'm not mistaken, and then afterwards I will moderate any questions that you folks have. So we'll start with Sandy.
Thank you, Vicky, and I would also like to echo your sentiments of thanking Children Now and all the people who have made this possible, and also the future of children. So, I really think that continuing to bring media issues before the public is something that we must do. And I'm going to talk today about it's the best of times and the worst of times. We have an unprecedented growth of digital technologies in this country. They're pervasive, they're what our children are doing, and they love them. They have a great time doing them. And at the same time, we have a public educational system that's falling behind, that's failing our children in many respects, and that we see our children, if you look at them in terms of international comparisons, they're not doing as well in math, science, reading literacy, or in physical fitness. Our children are obese and overweight. So what I want to really frame some of my comments about is how we can use what children love to solve a lot of the problems that we and our nation face with the public school system. And based on the presentations I saw this morning, it looks like many people are already miles ahead of that question. I'm going to start with what's the role of technology in schools? And I would say to you, what does a 21st century education mean? And the video framed that perfectly when you saw the children up there who were really telling us what it is that they do and what it is that we do. So they're playing with digital technologies and we're boring them. So what is it that we can do to make education a little more exciting? So what will children have to do in the 21st century? I would argue that they're going to have to be able to use digital technologies, that they have to use digital tools to survive. And that involves several different skills. One of them involves learning to read a screen and not just a book. You know, that our country has long prized itself on literacy, and obviously I make my living with words. What makes us unique as a species is our ability to use words. But we have other symbol systems that we can now use to communicate, and to be able to read that screen is something we take for granted and may not necessarily be true. So one of the things that we're studying right now at the Children's Digital Media Center is how very little children learn to read a screen, and not surprisingly, they learn better from a live adult than they do from a video presentation. A second major point that I think we need to remember, and it's been echoed throughout the presentations today, and that is the power of children to create knowledge, not just consume it. User-generated content, what is it that children make? What is it that's interesting to them? The personalization of information. So things that pop up on YouTube are very interesting to me. I think that if we look at that, it's telling you something about what matters to children, and by going into what matters to them, you have a better chance of reaching them in the process. And that a lot of these kinds of things that they make are also collaborative. That learning is no longer this isolated one-person show. Knowledge advances now. Science advances because teams of people work together on information, and you see kids doing it as well. So this sort of solo sort of position with one person advancing knowledge is being replaced in science, and our kids are doing it too. A third point, and Elizabeth points out that the content is the message, and maybe Marshall McLuhan didn't have it quite right. I would add to that, though, that there are symbol systems. You know, that the symbol systems and that the audio-visual symbol systems are extremely important in terms of how you get messages across to very young children. So that having pictures with words gives you two symbol systems, dual symbol systems to represent information. Interacting with those symbol systems is crucial. So I think we need to fine-tune a little bit and move away from simply verbal messages to think that now, in this day and age, we've moved past just having a printing press. We can show what we're thinking with digital tools that are also have visual messages and music and a number of different things. Next point. Learning is no longer vertical. We no longer live in a society, in terms of a household, where it's authoritarian, where information is like, you know, children are treated like, you know, they're in a hierarchy. It's much more horizontal. You know, it's a more democratic society, and children expect that when they're at school. So when they walk into a school, the other thing that's happened is that it's flipped around. The children often know more about the technologies than the teachers do. That puts the teachers at a distinct disadvantage. So Marshall, the power of the kids to teach the teacher and also teach the kids. There's no better way in the world to learn than to teach. So I think we need to move away from this whole system of top-down and really spread it out a little bit more. Using games to teach. I think if we follow the lead of some interesting work that was done by Calvert and Patricia Greenfield about video games teaching visual spatial skills that we pretty much neglected in our school systems, you can learn and have fun. And, this is informal learning. I think it's something that we have neglected too much and that we could clearly take advantage of in the school system. Another thing that we've done with after-school programs is using adver games, where we have little Pac-Man come around and eat healthy snacks. So, the kids afterwards are more likely to choose healthy snacks to eat than unhealthy snacks. And we're now looking at things like We Fit. We've already done some studies, where you've got kids who are moving around as they're doing gaming, and they burn more calories when they're playing games like this. So using games as a way to engage and to get them to lose weight. Now, though the weight loss hasn't been demonstrated, the state of West Virginia, my home state, has actually incorporated that as part of a curriculum now. So I think it has promise. And the other thing that, and when we're looking at the literature, that I find fascinating is that if you exercise, and it's not been shown for exergames yet, but it could be, and we're looking at this, that what it does is it stimulates parts of the brain that result in planning, cognitive control processes, executive control, so making our kids physically fit and restoring physical education to the classrooms could have some broader impact. And when that happens, kids are doing better. When you see them exercising, they're doing better in the short haul on academic tasks. So, I think that there are some ways that we could use these sorts of things in after-school programs and hopefully eventually in schools. And I would scale up using after-school programs as a way to demonstrate viability. And if it works, spread it out to other after-school programs and eventually see if it could be incorporated into the school itself. At a policy level, we've tried for many years to get camera through the Senate and the House and signed into law. And it's been a huge amount of work, and it has not panned out. CAMERA is the Children in Media Research Advancement Act, and it was designed to provide funding to scholars so that they could study some of these crucial media issues that then could feed Congress about policy decisions that they were making so that it could be well informed. And that a lot of times media researchers are not at the table when funding decisions are made, and so this would put people at the table who would actually understand what needs to be done. We've gotten it through the Senate. We have not made it through the House. The climate in some ways couldn't be better in terms of having control of the House and the Senate and the presidency by Democrats who are more inclined to pass laws like this. It's been hard to get it out of subcommittees now in the Senate, which are bipartisan. But in terms of the money that would be attached to that, the economy would not sustain it at this point in time, is my view. And we've also lost, Senator Clinton was one of the key people, so was Senator Brownback, who is going to be leaving the Senate as well, and Senator Lieberman. So we would have to totally rebuild some of the structure. So I don't think camera might be our best strategy, haven't given up on it. But the place that I do have a lot of feelings that could hold more promise for us is something that's already law, and it's called the Children's Television Act. And it's something that Children Now did some work on last year, and they concluded that the programs were educationally insufficient. The Children's Television Act has two parts to it. One of them has to do with how much educational programming, educational informational programming is on the air, and the other has to do with control of how much time can be spent showing advertisements. So I think in this kind of digital age that we need to expand it. It's time to revisit it. And it's time to think about, for instance, the websites that are associated with the programming. Why not take a look to see if those websites that are out there actually can support the programming and provide better learning? And nobody has really taken up that charge, and the broadcasters aren't expected to do it. But viable children's programs now must come with website content. That's just a given. So why not take a better look at that? The other thing is the ad content itself. Hardly anything has been done with the ad content other than to levy fines once in a while about people who show too many advertisements, which is just a drop in the bucket for what the marketers are making. So what if we were to take something like the obesity crisis, and I talked to Jeff McIntyre a little earlier today, who is thinking along similar lines, although he thinks it's difficult, but to try to control more of the content. Not just the amount, but to really begin to move into what are you marketing to our children so that we can have better products up there for them and actually begin to work with marketers. We all eat, you know, and I happen to be a fan of chocolate. I usually eat chocolate every day. So, you know, I think that there's nothing wrong with that, but it has to do with portion sizes and the balance of what it is we're trying to sell our kids. We have people in the Senate, I think, who would be very supportive of us right now. One is Senator Rockefeller. You know, I think he is somebody who has a vision, very interested in kids. And the last thing that I would say is that in terms of the best of times and the worst of times, we have a window of opportunity to act right now with control in Congress and also our president who would be interested in these concerns. But we have the worst of times in terms of the budget. I mean, we have a terrible budgetary crisis right now. And I would like us to think a little bit outside the box and maybe think about having an integration where we would have a public-private partnership, where we might create a think tank, where we would bring together people who are part of industry and also who are part of what's going on in the media world, and also researchers and the policymakers and the advocates, and really get them to sit down at the table and think about how we can create business models that are healthy for children educationally and that also don't put children's programs off the airwaves. So, thank you.
Well, greetings. I'm Jeanne Elliott from the Bayside S.T.E.M Academy. I'm the principal, and yes, I went to the other side. And I'm not here to advocate completely for technology. I think everybody should spend at least 1 year of their life in a school, business people, and if you're really brave, become a principal. So it's great to be here. I was especially grateful at 11:20 when I missed my lunch duty. Yes? And anybody who's worked in schools knows what I mean. So it's a pleasure to eat this lovely lunch, and thank you for inviting us. I gave a lot of thought to the question, how do we integrate technology? What would we do to really make it something that we breathe and not think about at all? And I want to retrace a bit. I want to introduce the school. I want to give you our technology case study. And I want to offer you my algorithm for making utilization something that happens all the time. And then I'll end with my concerns. So Bayside S.T.E.M Academy, of course, stands for Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics. And this means that our school, that students spend more time becoming fluent in these disciplines, speaking this code. And we think that's exciting and important, especially for the jobs that they will be facing. And we have a special dialect we speak, and that is design thinking. And this is because we're the fortunate beneficiaries of partnership with a few professors from the School of Ed at Stanford and the D School. We've undergone boot camp training, and it is as fun as that sounds. And our students learn to innovate and problem solve and understand who the user is of whatever problem that they're looking at. And most of all, probably most important for middle schoolers' maturation, is they learn to empathize. And by that we mean that they think about who the problem might be affecting and what the issues are. And in order to find that out, those students need to ask a lot of questions, and they need to get underneath the problem, they need to work in groups, and they need to quickly prototype solutions. And those solutions don't end right there. The students are asked to test what the prototype is to what the user set, if it's working for the user. So in my view, we're teaching a special dialect. We're teaching STEM, we're teaching design thinking. And I would imagine that you can already see why technology is very important to us. Not only is it important for instruction, as the air we breathe, as the telephones we use, but it's important as students learn to prototype. And I imagine that most of the times when they prototype, they use technology in these prototypes. There are always computers in their solutions. If they're trying to figure out how to build a better car, how to create a more green environment, how they're solving a school problem, a local problem, a global problem, they're thinking with technology in their head. So I'm going to skip forward to several electives that we have at our school that have technology at the base and design thinking at the base, include courses such as Jessica described, along with the games people play, which is teaching kids to look at how numbers are used to manipulate and shape thinking. The Science of Sound teaches kids the technology about how soundtracks are created, and architecture and design and so on. So it's a different kind of master schedule at our middle school, and it's a different kind of program overall. A little bit of background on the kids. We have about 500 kids, 10,000 kids plus or minus in the district. And at our school, over half the kids are receiving free and reduced lunch, a proxy for what the socioeconomic status is of the families of these kids. And in addition, there are at least half of the kids that are EL, and probably at the medium range of language acquisition. So we're interested in pursuing the question about how design thinking and STEM and technology relates to the learning for those kids. In addition, at the school, which is something new, is we have GATE clusters. So we're not just reaching to figure out how to meet the needs of a language learner or kids that come from a language impoverished environment, but also how to provide a very rich curriculum. So you can see that technology is in our minds, and we really need it to work. But the case study I want to share is where we've been and where we are now and where we think we'd like to go. In the past, if you just go back 8 years, there was not technology use at the school 8 years ago. Now, I know in technology years, that's like cat years, it's 30 years ago, but for us, 8 years ago, people did not use email routinely. If I asked teachers, this is to the question that was put forth to the previous panel, use your email. I'm not going to put the memo in your box. That was met with wide eyes, and I don't think so, and that will never work. And how does a school get to a place where, in fact, email is completely normal? You're asked to read your email routinely, and for business people in the room, that may sound outlandish, but in schools, it's actually not. And to ask people to go paperless is not outlandish, and we do want to move in that direction. We have all kinds of use of technology, Read 180, Study Island. Jessica showed you the school loop use that increases parent communication. Once we put it in place, we couldn't really take it away because parents really benefited from that, as did the students. Textbook modules are online. Intervention is online. Online learning. This is all available. But what are the barriers? And my future column actually should just be my present column, but it's not because of infrastructure issues. And so to address the question of how do we make technology fully integrated in a school setting, even when people are ready, it takes more than what one would think the equation would be. So, of course, you need the resources. And what enabled us to scale up was a technology grant. You know, it's my electromagnetic field. This is why they're going to have those toys that can read the mind. It's that. Yeah? Anyway, the resources to invest in the materials and the equipment required, but the thing that also has to be in that sentence is the upgrades. And that's where schools have gone awry, walking into the landscape of a technology not so rich place that hasn't undergone the investment and the planning. You'll find lots of computers and hardware, software, things not being used because the upgrades haven't been budgeted. You obviously need professional development, and at our school, the only way to really make this take off was to build through communities, teacher communities, teachers teaching one another, teachers going out and becoming part of the Krause Innovation Center and other centers where they learned technology and then they came back as trainers. And over time, making it part of the culture of the school that we would have School Loop. Now that doesn't seem, I imagine, if you're not in schools, like a big thing, but it was a real shift for us to say to every teacher, you will have your assignments up and you will communicate to parents routinely. And those two things together should equal utilization. So my bare minimum equation is resources plus professional development would equal utilization, or for this forum, full integration, ongoing integration, because at this point we do know that it's important for our STEM focus and for design thinking in that STEM focus. But somehow it doesn't equal utilization. And that's that third future column that doesn't come to be because the problem is that even with all of those present, you need to have connectivity. You need to have infrastructure there to support so teachers don't have a problem of getting online. They don't have a problem with students saving their work. They don't have a problem with all of the things that impede instruction. So if this is going to work, if we're really going to make this work, we need to think about efficiencies. We need to think about how connectivity is ever present. Much the way I was thinking this morning in the military, you wouldn't say, oh, sorry, technology's down. It should be the same in schools. If the phones aren't working, we fix them. If the computers aren't working, it should be fixed immediately. It'll be so memorable. The digital divide that comes to mind is not just the haves and the have-nots, but it's really the human capital divide. And this is tied for me to student safety issues. A lot has been said today about how students use the resources at hand, but from an administrative point of view, what we see kids doing and what we see that effect in the school as students slam each other online, none of that's made up from technology. It's not a result of technology, but it's exacerbated exponentially. And it's really causing a shift in student culture. And I think that's something to discuss fully. And finally, the policy disconnects. You like that? I'm not going in order, but, just keep you on your toes. The policy disconnects include the following. If we can receive a technology grant and go up to scale the way we have in our school, what is being done from a policy standpoint to ensure connectivity, to ensure upgrades over time? And certainly in this present state budget, we know what happens when your categoricals get tiered. It's a new verb. We no longer know for sure that we can do what we said we were going to do. And guess what? Suddenly, the telephone doesn't matter, except for you replace that with the technology. And that's a concern. So thanks very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for all of you, again, being here and for this engaging discussion about the media and technology. And I'm Gay Krause, and I started the Center for Innovation at Foothill College about 10 years ago. But in order to get there, I basically was a teacher, assistant counselor, assistant principal, and principal at a middle school in Mountain View. So I basically saw professional development as a whole going kind of downhill during my years of being involved in education. And one of the reasons I became a principal, and I think many other people became that, is that they really thought they were going to be able to improve. We really thought we were going to be able to improve teaching and learning and really improve conditions in our schools and we're going to be able to be really involved with professional development. Well, once I found out that many of my jobs did not include very much professional development, but were included with more day-to-day kinds of things, I decided that the president of Foothill College came to me and said, how would you like to start a new center and work with educators? And you can spread your ideas about professional development, and especially the use of technology throughout the region and maybe throughout the state or the nation. Well, it sounded like an exciting startup project to me. And so eventually, the third time she came back to me, I decided I'd kind of do that. So we began the center about 10 years ago, and we have trained about 12,000, mostly teachers, have come through our center. And we have some very targeted programs that are more substantial and longer lasting. And we have about 783 teachers have gone through our more comprehensive programs where we provide stipends and things. If you're interested in that part, there's more information outside, so I won't go into that too much. But it's been a very exciting and worthwhile engagement. I think there's so much professional development that needs to be done. And we've all been talking about technology, and it seems that most people are pretty much on the same page about it's happening, we're going to go there. It's sort of like, how can we really make use of the potential to educate, and what can we do to change our schools and really use the technology profitably? I think that's really where lots of the discussion goes. And I was laughing at Vicky's comments about the hands-on and real-time education and things. And I think most of us would believe that that would be the most ideal and the best way to go. But in my middle school experience and high school experience, what I found is that things like hands-on experiments and things weren't happening on a regular basis. Because there was so much time, money, energy involved in doing it, they happened periodically, and they were the best experiences. But now, through technology, we're able to do them every day. And so that does make a little bit of a difference, sort of, to me. I think in order to effectively integrate the role of technology in education, we need to improve the education's infrastructure and the ability to effectively adopt these technologies throughout the system, not just in certain areas, but in all areas. The magnitude of the change required for us to really get into the technology age that we need, where we need to be, is almost going to be like what we did with Sputnik. I'm sure many of you have heard that example so far, and World War II, and how we've made some changes there. This implies integrating industry with these efforts. We can't just do it alone. Industry's got to be there to help us with the hardware, the software, and encouraging those kinds of changes. Policies, and when we talk about policies need to be developed that will provide stimulus funding and state funding and federal funding. We need to be doing it on a large scale in order for us to prepare our students for what we're calling the 21st century learning. I'm concerned that it'll be the 22nd century before we might get there with some of the policies and things that we have in place today. We've been talking about preparing our students for the 21st century. I remember since 1980. And it seems like, 30 years later, we're still using that terminology. I mean, it should be really have happened by now. Our focus has really been on professional development for teachers. And high-quality professional development is so critical, and it needs to be student-centric. I think of many of the points that I had thought of and that I really believe in, many of you have covered this morning, and I think that's actually very encouraging. I'm glad to hear that people are kind of getting somewhat on the same page, that we're not all thinking in many divergent ways. I'm particularly concerned about changing not only the technology and the availability of it in schools, but changing our pedagogy and the way we teach, the way it actually gets implemented. If we're just going to have computers in classrooms and we're still going to have the instructor stand up and kind of lecture at the students, or instead of taking notes in person, they're just going to take notes on the computer, then we really haven't made the kinds of changes in education we'd like to see. And that's why a lot of the studies, I think, are showing that, they're not showing the student achievement gains that we would expect to see, because there needs to be some changing in the way we actually teach and approach things. And that probably has to start back not only in the professional development we're able to provide for current teachers, but we need to go back to the schools of education. And I know there's several people in the room here that are kind of involved in that. And they need to be using, not modeling the kinds of instruction, the student-centric sort of approach, instead of the teacher just standing up and imparting information. The pedagogy behind the equipment and the use is really the most critical part of our whole process. I don't know how many of you probably read the book Disrupting Class with Clayton Christensen from Harvard, but he really makes really strong points about such things as if you can't find the right kind of schools and you can't find the things you want to do, let's look at online. And I know that came up this morning in some of the conversations. The availability of what's out there today is so much different than what was available even 2 or 3 or 4 years ago. We now are able to get small kinds of devices that people can't afford. We had a program this summer at the center where we give out stipends to teachers. That we get people in the community to donate funding for the stipends for the teachers. And we suggested to the teachers that were complaining about the fact that they don't have any equipment, how are we going to do with some of these things that we just learned we're all excited about if we don't have the equipment. And I would suggest, with the stipend you just got, you could probably buy half a set of some kind of mini netbooks, or you could probably do some of those kinds of things and go to your parents' club and tell them of your needs. And you can write small grants now that the equipment and things are available to you. If you're really serious and really interested, you can find some ways. You don't need to buy $2,500 computers these days. Things are available. We were teaching them to use iPod touches and such small devices like that are in the $200 and $300 range. And there's lots more available and coming online all the time. I think another thing that we need to do when we talk about policies is to fund research that helps us even further learn how different people learn. And how can we possibly use technology in order to customize learning? I mean, we're going to have to, if we're really trying to change education and improve it in our country, we're going to have to customize education much more thoroughly than we do now. I know with special education and things, we've always kind of gone with that sort of model, but the model that we have of somebody standing in front of the classroom and teaching 30 students is just something we've been doing for the last century. And how are we going to make changes in that? And that's with technology that's available now, we can customize the education for each student. And we need to put some funds and some thinking behind that. And all of us get behind some of these measures to make a difference. As all of us know that with the economic needs and the problems that have existed in our state, that we cannot afford to lose our competitive edge, either in our state or in our country. And that's really important to all of us. So look forward to having any of you visit our center, where we'd love to see you at the Foothill College campus, and there's materials outside, so please come visit us and see what we're up to and engage with us. We love the conversation, and this has been a wonderful day to share with children now and the future children. Thank you.
Afternoon. My name is Craig Wacker. I'm a program officer with the MacArthur Foundation in Chicago. I'm the final panelist. And I think it's worth noting that as the final panelist, we're still left with the question today, what do we do, right? And perhaps more importantly, how do we talk about what to do? I think this last question is fundamentally a question of policy. What should policy look like in this space? Or perhaps more importantly, how do we consider what policy is in this space? Is it federal statute? Is it state statute? Is it legal precedent? Is it normative behavior? We heard one of the earlier panelists talk about that. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about how the dynamic environment that we're entering forces us not only to consider what it means for kids as individuals, but I think forces us to consider a different definition of policy, or at least the levers that we traditionally associate with policy. I'm going to talk a little bit about the DML portfolio, the Digital Media and Learning portfolio at MacArthur, set up, I think, our own evidentiary basis for why we think this is a transformative moment, and then go into this broader definition of policy as we understand it. The Digital Media and Learning portfolio launched in 2006 as a 5-year, $50 million portfolio, looking at pretty much the array of issues that have been surfaced today. And I think that's demonstrated by the fact that several of our grantees are represented here. I think notably Sasha, who actually made a pitch to me earlier for further support of Quest Atlantis. I want to say that actually that was an incredibly noteworthy act of kind of conference-going judo to ask in front of 200 people for additional support for a great project. And, I'm just going to say this for the record. But one of the projects that you did not hear about is called the Digital Youth Project. It's a multi-year ethnography out of Berkeley that followed 700 kids with 2,000 hours of online, basically, observation of their behavior. And I think what it gave us was a texture for what online experience is like for kids. If there's one takeaway from that, it's participation. Participation, right? We have different genres of participation now that are afforded by digital media. What's worth noting is what has not changed, right? Kids are still hanging out. They're still kind of hanging out with kids, that they meet in their classroom, that they know through school, that they know sort of that are geolocated with them. But they're also doing some really interesting things like messing around. These are actually rubrics that have been introduced by the project. They're making their own multimedia artifacts. They're sharing them with friends. They're commenting on other people's work. They're remixing content, and they're using social media to do it. And that's very interesting. You saw, I think, some of the evidence of that in the presentations from the educators in earlier panels. They're also geeking out. They're getting deep into issues of passion and interest, right? They're finding other people online and coalescing around communities of interest in peer-based learning in ways that wouldn't have been possible in the past, at least not to this degree, because the technology just wasn't there to do it. So what does that mean? What does it mean for policy? What does it mean for institutions? I think, again, you heard evidence in earlier panels that learning institutions broadly, which I think include museums, libraries, and schools, need to adapt to this new reality. They can exploit it, right, but they also need to adapt to it. And if you agree with that, right, if you agree that learning institutions need to change, then I think policy needs to change as well. Not only how we talk about prioritization within existing statute, but how you actually define policy, how you actually think about the levers that are pushing on these issues. And by way of example, I'll talk about federal policy. So No Child Left Behind, how does that really function? Most money in No Child Left Behind goes out through formula distributions to state education agencies that then distribute the money to districts. And along the line are all kinds of conditions set on the distribution of that money, standards, assessment, accountability, and all of that have grown increasingly strong in the 40-plus years since the first passage of the law, right? The question I would ask is this hierarchical, institutionally based way of making education policy symmetrical to the non-hierarchical, peer-based, interest-based culture of learning that you see in evidence in a project like the Digital Youth Project? I mean, the short answer, it's a very complicated question, but the short answer is sort of no, right? We need to think about other things to do. So what do we do? How do we understand policy? I'm going to borrow from Larry Lessig, which is always dangerous, I think. But he describes in Code 2.0, which came out in 2006, basically the online environment as the architecture, law, and customs that regulate individual and collective behavior online, right? These are the things that actually shape people's behavior when they're on the internet, when they're online, when they're interacting with others. And he actually comes up with 4 categories of things that regulate people's behavior. The conceit I want to offer now is that these 4 categories should in some way serve as kind of a stand-in for a redefinition of policy, because they go outside of traditional statutory mechanisms for influencing people's behavior, and they understand the very sort of dynamic and asymmetrical way that people are interacting online now. So the first category is laws, statute and regulation, No Child Left Behind. Norms, and we heard a little bit about normative behavior earlier. What is normative behavior in sort of a social network or an online community, right? Do these communities actually police their own membership? Do they have status? Do they have laws by which people actually behave? Yes, they do. Markets. Well, clearly the commercial space in this world is incredibly important, right? If information weren't worth something, then Facebook wouldn't be worth billions of dollars, right? And code, finally. Code, which Lessig defines basically as the underlying architecture of the internet, right? Software, the stuff that makes choices for you. You know, when you go on Amazon, choices are being made for you, right? Options are being made available to you, right? There's an underlying law to that. Lessig says that this structure, this architecture of the internet is a de facto law because you can't see it, but it's making choices for you. So what does this mean in the context of youth media policy? I'm not going to talk about learning in this case because I think the learning examples are good, but there's a better example which is associated with pretty much every online learning experience now, which is privacy. What does privacy mean? What does youth privacy mean in the context of like the tween population? According to law, right, we can understand it as the Fourth Amendment, although for minors, what that really means, I think, is an open question. Just an aside, actually 2 months ago, I was on a panel with the Chief Privacy Officer of the Department of Homeland Security, and it was the first time I learned that you don't have sort of right of protection against search and seizure when you're at a border crossing. It's just something for you, like, travelers to remember that anybody can seize your laptop when you're coming into the country at any time, and it's not unconstitutional. I was kind of freaked out by that. What's interesting in the context of federal law, though, is that federal laws increasingly, with the Children's Internet Protection Act as an example, putting conditions on the distribution of infrastructure money to economically disadvantaged libraries and schools. And those conditions are very much about monitoring and filtering of content, which you can argue is good or bad. The only thing I would ask is that the most effective way to protect tweens, for example, and to educate them about how to sort of behave online and how to react to certain content that they may or may not come across? I think it's an interesting question. Norms. Is it more effective to control people's behavior through sanction or to empower them by giving them the option to articulate their own preferences? And an example I would state here is, how many people know Creative Commons? Just raise your hand. Most people. Creative Commons is a copyright licensing system, right? And it functions, in my opinion, as much as sort of a normative behavior for certain online communities as a copyright licensing scheme, right? So to be in certain communities, you basically just use Creative Commons to tag your work. A question would be, can there be normative behavior associated with, let's say, privacy protections, wherein you have a codified system of privacy levers that a young person could adhere to, where they could actually use those to identify what they want to do, and it would be extra legal, but it might be more effective than something coming in from the outside. Markets. A few people have mentioned this. Should we partner with the private sector, right? Should we work with social networking platforms to create interfaces, to create user agreements that are accessible, that can be understood by children, that can be understood by users, and that are interoperable, so that multiple platforms are actually going to be adopting the same thing, so that when you jump between platforms, as so many tweens do, they know what they're getting into. And then finally, code. Is privacy, for example, and I think you could ask this about a lot of learning questions, is it a design challenge, right? Is it about actually setting up a series of choices and a series of decisions or a series of transparencies for a user such that they know exactly what they're doing, or that they actually get some feedback on their decisions? I mean, that's the thing that's fundamental. You could argue that all these other domains existed before the internet, right? But with code, what's interesting is that the design principles associated with the user's experience online are in fact something new, because you can do so many different things with someone's experience as they're interacting with a social network. So why take this 30,000-foot view? I think it's because we are in a time where traditional deliberation around statute and regulation simply does not recognize the complexity of the issues that emerge from youth experience with social media. I think we need to understand options across all of these domains, or some other, to be effective to take these issues on, right? It's not about No Child Left Behind. It's not simply about FCC regulation. It's about kind of pushing on all of these different levers in a coherent way. What we've done is we've supported the Berkman Center to have a youth media policy working group to try to outline this terrain, right? So they understand what is statutory, what's not statutory, what potentially is about public information, what's potentially about legal precedent. So in closing, what I want to do is completely contradict myself and say that, notwithstanding, I think, this broader frame, which I do think is important, over the next 12 to 24 months, there are going to be sort of unparalleled opportunities at the federal level in policy that we should not ignore. They include the National Broadband Plan, which is being written by the FCC. They include the ESEA reauthorization, aka NCLB. And they also include the stimulus money, which is still subject to some regulation. Now, there are differing levels of opportunity in there, but I think what we can do is identify a vision for what we think the future of social media in the context of youth learning might be. I think that's important, and I think that's an appropriate role for the federal government. I think we can also potentially prioritize research in this space. I know some of the other speakers have mentioned that. And at the end of the day, I think what we need to do, which is something that federal policy, in my opinion, has always been imperfect at, is to allow practitioners at the local level to innovate in this space, right, without fear of sanction. Because I think that is not necessarily how federal policy has functioned over the last 7 or 8 years. Thank you.
Wonderful. Now we get to the discussion and questions, and so all of you be thinking of your questions, and I'm just going to kick it off. I know the focus for this session is sort of how do we get there? How do we achieve the goals that many folks in this room have for incorporating more technology into educational realms? And I guess I'll break it down to public policy to begin with. Would any of our panelists care to let us know, what do you think would be the single most important piece of public policy at the federal or state level that would facilitate more use of educational media technologies in the classroom? What would be the most important thing for the government to do?
I think research is...
And research, and tell me more, like...
Well, so, I mean, it's an open question whether the Institute of Education Sciences, right, which is the Department of Education's research wing, it's sort of quasi-independent, is actually going to focus on these issues at all. But there's always a danger that issues of how to kind of incorporate social media get conflated with things like longitudinal data systems and things like that, which may be of utility, but it's a totally different issue. So, but if you look at the hundreds of millions of dollars, right, that are in the IES budget, I think it would be hugely useful if even only one of the competitions, let's say something that was in the $10 million range, looked at, demonstrations in this space. That's much more money than typically the philanthropic sector can bring to these issues. Moreover, if you look at longitudinal research like the Early Childhood Longitudinal Survey, one could imagine adding items, right, associated with this domain to give us a much more granular take on what is in fact happening with new media and youth exposure with new media that gives you a very robust take on, over time, what it means for people in their life experiences. So, I mean, I think those are two immediate opportunities, and those are just in the Department of Education.
All right. Anybody else have anything they want to add to that? What about at the business level? What policies from business or practices from business would be top of the list in order to promote greater use of technologies in schools? Anybody in the audience have an answer to that?
Well, it's certainly to their advantage. I mean, it's certainly our businesses and industries, especially in Silicon Valley, are based largely around the computer or technology kind of industry. And so for them to get behind the schools and the educators and the policy makers at both our state and federal levels, so I think it's to their own advantage as well as to the advantage of all of us to improve education.
Back here.
One of the things that kind of concerns me is when I look at people who are the directors of technology in school districts, I often see that they're teachers that have been promoted up into those positions. And I'm not sure, because I'm a teacher, I can never imagine, and I'm a tech teacher, Gay knows I do that stuff. I mean, I can never imagine myself understanding the technological infrastructure as completely as somebody who has that background, and then to have them learn and train as understanding how that tech can be used efficiently and effectively in a classroom oftentimes in business models, when they're doing staff development within an organization, they will take teachers and teach them what it is to teach because they've already had the training in teaching. It seems like we need to flip that for school districts, for the IT departments, so that we have the IT people and teach them what it is that needs to happen for classroom instruction. And I don't see that happening. I think in terms of bringing in business for that kind of support might be beneficial.
Right here.
Thank you. I come out of the games industry, and I can tell you, I'm working on a new book on the positive influence of video games on society, and have interviewed about 75 people around the world in different industries, and a big portion of what I'm researching is games and education. And I can tell you that there are a lot of people who are not in education who have a lot of very big ideas about how to make a positive impact in education. And pretty much across the board, what they're saying is the system is broken and you're not going to fix it by bringing in people from the outside to work within the structure that already exists. So what people are looking at doing is reinventing how it's going to work, and big changes are coming in the next 5 to 10 years. People are looking at fixing education without working with what's there because it's too broken.
And I'm hearing you maybe say what we need is a way to facilitate greater communication between those in the media tech industries and educators so that there's more of a dialogue and a collaboration going on there. That's kind of what I'm hearing from both of the commenters there. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Donna Friedman, and I've been in the kids' media entertainment space my whole career on the commercial side. And I'm so glad that, Sandy, you raised your notion of the think tank, and from Elizabeth made a beginning reference to this notion of public-private collaboration. My question is, and I'm a huge advocate of that, because having been on the entertainment side, there's a lot of really passionate people who care about kids and want to make great stuff for kids. So my question to you guys is, why what are the barriers to this collaboration happening? To me, it seems so obvious, but clearly it isn't happening. So I'm curious to understand why it's not happening.
I think one of the things is a basic different worldview that sometimes gets kind of transmitted between people who are on a business side and people on education. That there's a lot of times this unnecessary antagonism between the two, that they don't share a common superordinate goal, which is to improve children's well-being. That somehow or other that there's a belief sometimes among educators, and I would include myself in this, that that somehow entertainment is not necessarily the best thing that kids should be doing, and it conflicts with the more serious work of education. But I think that there's room for edutainment, and that's part of what's happening in terms of looking at what kids are doing. And it's one of the reasons I think that something like a public-private partnership could really improve the dialogue between people who are in business, who know how to get kids' attention, and people in education who have a different message that they would like to communicate. I was at a Senate hearing this summer talking about the Children's Television Act, and proposed that they do this, and it had some traction. So I think that, and it's funding. It's like, who's going to fund it and who's going to be at the table? And you need the right mix of people, but it's an idea that I think is timely, and I think that we could move forward on. But I think listening to each other is a key reason that it hasn't happened before.
Kay, did you want to add anything to that?
No, just I think we also need to get more people from industry into our schools, even if it's short term. I mean, they've had like Principal for a Day kinds of programs and things for years, and some of those things were kind of cut out. I mean, they haven't been happening for the last few years, which is really a shame. I was thinking, even my own husband when many years here I've been involved in education, and he was involved in industry, and he had no clue. And he went in and was principal for a day in a high school in San Jose, and he came home and asked me 150 questions about things at schools and how they were operating and things. And he said, that you don't know anything about that. I'm sure it's different at your school and your location. I'm like, no. How about 95% of that is exactly right. No, the telephones don't connect to the outside world. They only connect to the office. You know, I mean, just common things like that. I mean, you know, and he immediately thought, well, I think the teachers must need a computer, or at least one computer on their desk. And I said, yeah, I think so. I mean, even 20 years ago. And so then we worked to see that that would happen. But I think as soon as you get the people from industry in the classrooms and in the schools, and they walk around and they even spend 1 or 2 days, it's just amazing that they have a much better understanding than what they do just from even being a parent if they go to school just on back to school nights or something. So to me, that's a real key. If there's anything we can do to kind of get them to come to schools, to hear some and see some of the realities in person, not just to get a laundry list of we'd like money for this or we'd like money for that, and that's what they hear about. Yeah, it should go both ways, and just as well, getting teachers and educators and industry helps them to understand what we would need to be preparing our students for, and getting the students out there as well. I mean, all those programs, I mean, shadowing in the workplace, some of those kinds of things have been going on in certain communities for years, but not on a broad scale fashion, and that's what needs to happen.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about teachers, because there's this kind of underlying theme here that teachers are afraid of technology, and that's one of the reasons that's slowing down the adoption of new media technologies in classrooms. Can any of you talk a little bit more about that, especially, you know, Jeanne and Gay? You know, is it a reality? Are there good reasons for it? What can be done to overcome that?
Well, I may just turn that a little bit on its head. I want to back up for a second to why things aren't happening in schools. And it's a really good question. Why isn't there more collaboration? Why isn't there more good give and take? And the first thing that comes to mind is, my goodness, there's a lot. And so then the next question is, because we do have many partners, we have partners in all kinds of business communities with people asking that precise question about how can we help, how can we support, what would fundamentally make a difference. The second point is that the real question within a school for the teacher is, what will increase my content pedagogy? That's what matters. What's going to make me the most powerful teacher ever for these students in front of me? Whether the unit of analysis is the classroom of 20, whether you've changed the way the school is set up for a completely different structure with many computers and online learning and teachers teaching differently. But back to the question, we have the research around content pedagogy. We have many partners interested, but the next step is, how do you make that more powerful in terms of the elixir? And I don't think we're there. And so that's not a bad place to start. I don't think we have to pretend we know why it doesn't quite work yet. One of the experiences we have in schools is their funding streams that are so complicated that people who are trained in business management look at a budget for a school administrator and say, you know, how do you move forward here? And I tell you, we've made it so complicated in schools to make things happen. There is money. We've made it very, very complicated. Perhaps it tells you a little bit why throwing money on the problem is not the correction. So I do think it's back to the point made that we should really be looking at schools looking completely different, that sticking the unit of analysis should change, and that we have the research about how to increase content pedagogy to make a difference for kids. So let's figure out how business partners and government and policies can support that.
And I think, in addition to what Jeanne said, which I certainly agree with you in that point, I don't think most of the teachers are really afraid of technology. I think what they're afraid of is that they don't have the depth and understanding of technology in order to stand in front of their students. And they're kind of embarrassed or afraid that the students might know more than they might know. And I think that's one of the things is we need to bring their level of comfort to a different level. And I think that's something that we've been talking about a great deal at our center is how do we do a better job of having a better depth of whatever we teach rather than just a little surface area, because people catch on to that, but then it's sort of they don't feel comfortable to go back to the classroom and use it. And they want to, as in addition, that they should be doing what things that came up this morning and letting some of the students teach. And to students teaching students, and then they need to be the guide on the side, and they don't have to be the one that really is totally proficient. And that's one of the other keys, and that's something that we're trying to promote and make teachers feel more comfortable in the fact that they don't have to be the one that knows everything. And that it's really good practice to let the students learn from each other and let the students teach you. And the same way with administrators. I think one of the real lacks is that we've been concentrating a lot on teaching teachers, but what we're also well aware of is that because administrators such as Jeanne and others are always so busy in things that they haven't had the time to really catch up as a whole to the same depth of technology understanding and technology proficiency. So they're a little, in certain circumstances, they're reluctant to get involved as well. So they're holding it back a little bit, just depending. Not Jeanne, I'm sure, but others.
Sandy?
I'd just like to reinforce your point, and I think it's not just at the school level that you're looking at, but also at the university level, where a lot of us know. I mean, I'm the director of the Children's Digital Media Center. My students know much more about how to do certain things than I do, but what I know how to do is enlist them and learn from them. A lot of the studies that I do are built around things that I am like listening to what they're doing, and then I study those sorts of things. So, and I think it's also like, if it breaks, what will I do? You know, like if I've got a whole presentation planned around using a technology in a classroom and my PowerPoint doesn't work, what do I do in that situation? And I get my students to stand up there and fix the projector. So I mean, it's really, and I do think that there's a sense of it's okay not to know things. And that's one thing I learned as a teacher, to just say, that's a really good question. I don't know the answer. Let me see if I can find out. And I go try to look that up. But if you're standing in front of people trying to use a technology and then it's not operating, then that's a little bit intimidating. So I think part of it is just being willing to say you don't know things as the adult, and to take advice from people who are younger than you, who have a different skill set.
Other questions and comments from the audience?
Can I just, I'm sorry, I just wanted to bookmark a project that's rolling out next month that is by the National Writing Project called Digital Is, which is a national project focused on teaching of writing through a digital context. National Writing Project, a great organization, doing, I think, some interesting work in this space. So if you're interested in this issue, look out for that mid-November.
Yes.
Laura Cassis-Fryer, Foothill, De Anza College District. So we've heard, I've listed a few things of how we reach the goal. One is research, 2, professional development. How do we make it less complicated for districts to use the money available? Tech support, and someone mentioned this morning, laptops for all the students. I want to know, would you add to this list, take away from this list, and of this list, what are your 2 top priorities?
Craig, you want to start?
Great. I think I'm going to start out by completely copping out and saying that it's everything is context driven, right? So here's an example. Does it make sense for Maine to give laptops to every student? Yeah, because they've got an incredible support system, in just about every district for the use of those laptops. Does it make sense everywhere to do that? No. I mean, I think there's mixed feedback on the Maine system as well. Professional development, consistent with what I just said about National Writing Project, I think can be incredibly powerful in this space, especially if it's done by an organization that has the kind of chops that National Writing Project has. How do you make policy stay out of the way? That's not just an issue about technology, right? I mean, that's an issue about No Child Left Behind, too, at least in my opinion. So I don't know if I would put that high on the list. I think it's just sort of a necessary condition. And I forget, what was the other?
Research.
I would put research at the top right now. Partly because I think we're in a space that's evolving so quickly that it's impossible to kind of take that timestamp and kind of inform an authorization, right? Which is very, I mean, policy at the state and federal levels in education, at least in my opinion, are very condition-based, right? And it's very much about compliance along certain conditions. And so what are those conditions for digital media and learning? I mean, I can't say that I know right now. So I would put research at the top.
Anybody else want to prioritize or add to that list, to-do list?
To stab at that, I would put professional development and technology support because I think you can have great technology and professional development, which is absolutely critical. I mean, I would never hand out a piece of equipment to anybody without some kind of support behind it or some kind of training to be sure that they had it, because I've seen too many examples of things being misused or not used at all without professional development. But I think the technology support that has to exist in the schools and in the school districts, even if it's nobody's talked about it here today yet, but even like a mouse squad type of thing, where a situation where there's training of the kids to be little tech cores to go around and help and support that. Some kind of technology support is absolutely critical, or the teachers won't take the chance just in the same direction of, especially with younger kids, that they feel like they can't help run the projector that well or whatever. So the technology support backbone of the district or the school needs to be there so teachers can get help when they need it or the students can get help when they need it. So those would be my two highest. Mm-hmm. But research, of course, is important. They're all important.
Jeanne or Sandy, you have anything to add?
I actually wonder why you'd want us to prioritize them, because they all seem to me to be very central players in terms of making the mix operate. I'm obviously a researcher, so I hold research in high esteem. I think the professional development is crucial. You know, you have a lot of people who don't really, who really are new to using the technology, and it is changing fast. But it's always going to change fast. And I keep hearing about, there's this newest generation, these new things are happening. Well, it's been happening for 10 and 20 years. There's always something new happening. So, that's going to continue to be the case. I love laptops for all students because kids will just get on there and play, and then they'll start innovating and making things up, and they're not scared. They are digital natives, so they just start diddling around, and then they come up with all kinds of innovative things that a teacher might not do, but without the professional development. We've heard from teachers today who guide their students, who get them to use that playfulness, their kids to use the playfulness in the ways that enhances education. So I think those two things are crucial, and without technology support, if it breaks, nobody uses it. So, yeah, but I think you've nailed down a lot of the crucial components that you need.
Okay, I saw a lot of other hands and folks ready for comments. Right here, yes. Yeah. There's a mic coming to you. Why don't you stand up and also let us know who you are?
Peggy Erickson, Director for CTAP Region 1, and we support providing professional development to teachers and administrators in a variety of areas. And I guess one of the things that I've noticed that makes a difference in terms of technology integration is school leadership. So that goes after the principal. If the leadership at a school or at a district provides that kind of leadership, then the teachers embrace it as a team. So I think that's pretty important. The funding stream, I think, is very important, and we're going to be going down with the ETT. It's going down to $100 million. So, it goes back at the sustainability. The language in the grant applications, when you talk about restrictions, it's telling us what a computer is and what kind of computer you're supposed to buy. And so those are the kind of things that I would like to see somebody impact, that language. So an iPod is not a computer. It's, but as far as I can see, if you're able to aggregate data and text it and send it and do something with it, it's a computer.
Okay, other comments or questions? Yeah.
I think this is addressed to Sandy, but maybe to Vicky as well. Sandy mentioned the Children's Television Act, and and we have something there. There's some legislation there that's already been passed. Sandy, Vicky, and I have been involved with for years, and saw how hard it was to, get that legislation through and get something implemented. But it's there, and you mentioned two aspects of it, Sandy, that that we might work on. There was a third aspect in the original legislation that was the Children's Television Endowment, and it's still on the books, isn't it?
I don't think it ever got funded, though.
It was funded in a minimal way, but it is still there. So that that just makes me think of two things that I think we ought to take a look at. If the Children's Television Act, instead of trying to fix it the way it is, and and get more content into broadcast programming, we work to convert it into the Children's Media Act. And try to broaden it out to what's really going on today, which is less about EI television programming and more about a broader media aspect. And we reminded somebody that there is a piece of legislation that somebody passed, wasn't funded, but it's there, to revive the idea of the endowment. And then all these things that we're talking about that, need some attention, need some money, and we all know it's a hard time, and it's never been any different, and we've all been around a long time. But, starting with legislation that's already there and lobbying around that is an effort I'd like to work with you guys on.
Sandy, what about using the Children's Television Act as a vehicle for promoting the development of more educational media content for kids?
I like having the Children's Television Act being used as that kind of vehicle, and I think there would be responsiveness to that sort of idea in some spheres. And I'm also thinking about the endowment, which could be used when I was talking about the public-private partnership, that there seemed to be some interest in, that if they would fund that we could begin to build children's media content around that area. I think one of the problems we've had is we keep arguing about what is educational. And the educational, informational, like a lot of the programs are social emotional in nature. And actually, a lot of those programs are well done that are social emotional in nature. And that if you look at people who write stories, what do they know how to do? They know how to tell stories that are about social emotional development, and trying to integrate cognitive or academic lessons into that kind of sphere is tough to do. Because it often becomes incidental rather than central to the story. So I think that we want to have things that are broadly based in terms of thinking about children's development, but also have kind of a balance there with some of the academic content. And the Magic School Bus that Fox picked up under your leadership, I think did a great job of having a story that also had a science lesson in it. And I'd like to see more programs like that created, and I think that's an excellent idea.
So,
Let's see.
Thank you. There are two other pieces of the policy puzzle that are in play right now that haven't been mentioned. One is the development of an educational technology plan that's in progress now with the Department of Education. I don't think we should raise our expectations that it's going to have a lot of value or impact or actually meaning to classrooms and schools. The other, though, that will is the National Assessment of Educational Progress's initiative to do a technological literacy assessment, which combines both the kind of technology we've been talking about here and the technology that people in engineering often talk about. So it could end up being the worst of both, with test scores showing that kids don't know anything about technological issues after the billions of dollars already spent in schools. So, but we should be aware that those things are in progress, in process, and be ready to deal with them once they become widely public.
are there things you think we should be doing to influence those processes?
I wish there were things we could be doing. I'm involved in the NAEP piece, and it's a very difficult and political issue, and I don't think the educational technology family is going to win this one.
Okay. Other comments or questions? Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. I'd like to go back to a comment, Vicky, that you actually made earlier that might play out in the dialogue. One of the great concerns that parents and educators and people have in general is the amount of screen time that a child will have and how that relates to human biology. So one of the conversations to have in creating new schools and creating new curriculum is to look at the concept of human communication itself, how human biology relates to technology. So to advance the conversation of content that is social emotional in nature and how does that relate to cognitive concepts, looking at more of a complete curriculum from early childhood, the 0 to 3 social engagement, secure attachments, into early physiology developments of brain stem, autonomic nervous system in the body, into then the play out of cognitive brain function curriculum. Okay, I'm coming from a medical science pediatric development perspective. Okay, right now what's lacking in both the schools of education is what is human communication itself, human biological communication, how does that relate to technology itself? On the macro level of academia, across the disciplines of physics, biology, social sciences, and humanities, human communication is an oddball. Okay, if you go to the National Communication Association, this conversation has been going on for several decades. How do you put human communication in a box? Okay.
Yeah, and likewise, I mean, this ties into the research question that we've been talking about here too, but it's also a matter of how you make the argument to people. So is one of the barriers to getting more technology in the classroom in an effective way the fact that we can't get over the argument about screen time, that when you're facing a skeptical public that says, look, is kids not spending enough time with media really the big problem I need to focus on in an era of scarce resources? So maybe part of the issue is how do you make the case about that? And would that be a fair question to put to the panelists to address?
Go ahead and turn into a question.
You're okay.
Yeah, that's certainly good.
Well, let me just begin by talking about how did we present information today. I stood and talked to you, but a lot of people did PowerPoints. The PowerPoints have become the standard in classrooms and academia now. I mean, if you look at the emphasis of what PowerPoint allows people to do in a presentation, it's become pretty standard, and kids make PowerPoints. So, I mean, when you're talking about human communication, this is mediated human communication. If you're talking about one of the things that's made the world a very small place is the ability to travel anywhere and to be able to see images that unite us. Where there are messages. Now, I'm not saying I always agree with the messages I'm seeing, but at the same time, I go anywhere in the world or in this country, and somebody in California can see the same sort of news being broadcast that they see on the East Coast. So when you're saying what is communication, I'm looking at communication is like there's face-to-face, but somehow or other that if it's virtual, that it's looked at as like not as important. I could turn it around and say, well, if you don't want screen time, I mean, how natural is it to have sit time? How natural is it to have children sit for hours and hours and hours on end in a school? Shouldn't they be up moving around and doing things that are more active in nature rather than sitting and listening to somebody speak to them? So there are all kinds of ways to think about what communication is, and in a traditional classroom and in college classrooms, it's a lot of times somebody standing and talking to people rather than there being some interaction or actual movement and active doing of projects in the classroom setting.
We've got about 5 more minutes. What about over here? You ladies at this table here, anybody have any comments they want to add or questions to throw out or anything? Awful quiet over there. Go ahead. Somebody bring a microphone over? Oh, you're taking it in. Oh, okay. All right. Anybody else have any comments? Yeah.
I just wonder, since we keep hearing that every other country in the world except for the United States is going to be advanced like next year, and all our kids are going to be all, on the streets next year. It may be a little dramatic, but so what is it that we're supposed to be using this technology to level the ground, as Thomas Friedman would say, to make it a little bit more, back on our side too, since we seem to have lots of diversity here
Why don't you go ahead and take the microphone, because we want it to be recorded, what you're saying.
Sorry. I'm just wondering what are you suggesting, since we started out kind of with a scare thing that, you know, in China, there's more honor students now than every person living in the northern United States. I think that was the statistic. Mm-hmm. And how can we, as Thomas Friedman said, you know, suggest we have to make it a level playing field again to shift back the ground, because we do have such a diversity here, and it leads to such richness, and it does lead to problems, but it also leads to real ingenuity. So how can we integrate everything that you're telling us about to help us, all scoop forward?
Yeah, did you want to answer that? We'll have them answer it too.
I mean, I think inherent in the question was, you know, what is this technology going to do for us? How is it going to help things? And I think one of the MacArthur Foundation and a bunch of us who are a part of that work have talked a lot about switching schools from a place of kind of content acquisition to a place of meaningful participation. And in part, what the technology does is it starts to switch ownership over content. And I think that the challenges that we have, that we need to think about, is how do we create structures that allow that content that they can have ownership over start to kind of overlap with the kinds of things that are going to prepare them to participate in the 21st century. And part of the tropes that are being retouted as what succeeding in schools in the U.S. looks like are becoming very distant from what it means to succeed outside of the schools. So a big argument in the morning and somewhat in the afternoon is we need to rethink, for example, and I think Craig was leaning to this, and some of the other ones around standards and what counts as evidence, and what are schools being held accountable to, and how do we reinforce that as a society so it doesn't force us back into a very kind of non-useful set of outcomes that really aren't preparing our generation. So I guess to give you a firm kind of response to your question is I think that what we need to do is switch from a very old school acquisition towards success on standardized tests to a different kind of education that is preparing kids to define their futures, to see themselves in their work, and then ultimately we need to structure that in a form that allows that some sort of accountability among maybe at the district level or the country level. So that would be one response to, I'm not sure if it got there, to the question you were asking, that a move away from a content acquisition focus towards success on sorting items to a different kind of school, and technology might allow the exact diversity and issues that you're bringing up to be better addressed.
Sorry, Craig, you want to add something?
Just a quick follow-up, and this doesn't really, this kind of bounces your question. I apologize. But I think that one interesting experience we've had at the foundation is being approached by people overseas from a variety of different contexts, whether it's like multilateral lending agencies, ministries of education, asking us about our research, asking us what constitutes kind of innovative digital media and learning. Everybody's facing this challenge. I think people kind of conflate PISA results with, technology and education, digital media and learning, which are actually two terms that we see as conflated as well. I don't think there's a simple answer, and I think everybody's actually facing the same challenge. What I will say is on the higher education side, we've met with a lot of people in places like India who there's just a completely different risk tolerance for doing online content, for restructuring the delivery of education. And that might actually have some implication going forward about how people are trained and how people sort of get degrees in those places. But it's a hugely complex issue, and I haven't seen anybody who has the answer perfectly yet. Well, so... Oh, okay. So in India, just recently they were considering putting aside $100 million US dollars to create something like 35 online universities, right? I don't think the legislation went through, but if it did, it would be a fundamentally different way of kind of delivering education to a part of society. I mean, one of the problems there is that the higher education system can't handle the capacity, right? Can't handle demand, right? I don't know necessarily that we face the exact same challenge, and I don't know that a mirror image of their capacity to do that is a reason to fundamentally question the strength of our higher education system. I just don't. I think a lot of things are thrown around. I think in the K-12, or sort of middle school, level, that the PISA results are often a reason for kind of alarm and become kind of a rallying cry that our system, our monolithic education system, can't kind of react to these challenges. And I guess what I'm saying is, and this is, I'm going to say anecdotally, the people that I've talked to overseas, mostly in Europe and to some extent Australia, they're facing the same challenges with the integration of social media into schooling. And while there are innovative things happening, I haven't seen the Holy Grail yet.
Okay, other panelists want to weigh in on that?
I think that's absolutely true, but you just remember back from and certainly content is so important, and we all feel it is because we're being measured with that on the tests, and that's what's getting out to the rest of the world. But I think we also do need to reflect back on just what you saw even in that little video clip, that we're preparing kids for careers that don't exist today. And we're preparing them for 14 different jobs in the next 30 years or something, So we need to be sure that we're preparing them for teaching them how to learn and how to gain information. And that's one of the things that I think technology can really help with. And so only the content that's required, I think it can help them learn how to learn and how to do research and how to prepare themselves for the future, because a lot of things that exist right now are not going to be existing when some of the 6-year-olds are 25 and are really getting into their careers. That's just another way to look at it as well.
Jeanne or Sandy, is there anything you want to... Jeanne?
Well, I would just add a couple of reflections. The S.T.E.M study, the first analyses back 15, 16 years ago, there was a really interesting remark in one of the summaries that stated, yes, the U.S. students are behind, but why are the creative things coming out of this country in spite of those results? And I think that's fun to play with when you think about how to move forward with schools. I do think that we could leverage resources better. I think that there's a role for technology where kids' needs are met. We ask teachers to do a tremendous amount with a range of levels in a classroom. So wouldn't it be smart to set things up differently? But back to the social, emotional, cognitive question, I don't think I could replace artificial intelligence for the conversation, a good Socratic conversation. How is the student ever going to learn? In the family, of course, but in the school, it's an appropriate place to have a conversation where you're puzzling over an idea and beginning to build the kind of brain networking that gets you thinking about why something's right, wrong, and defending it. That's why it's not either or, it's how do we meld these things and make a powerful school setting. We know a lot about how to do that, so that's where research comes in and putting all the pieces together.
Sandy, quick final thought.
I think teachers are asked to do too much. I think that is really the crux of the reason that we are so far behind in terms of what's happening in the world, that teachers are supposed to be surrogate parents, that the schools now provide child care, that all the sort of, it used to be schools were for academic lessons, and so now, they are the gatekeepers at so many levels. I mean, they're supposed to be telling people if there's some kind of abuse at home. I mean, the list goes on where, the schools and the teachers just have huge and vast amounts of responsibilities. And that, if you look at parents in some of these other cultures, parents see themselves as somebody who works with the school, and that it is in Asian cultures, it is their fundamental responsibility to educate their children. And our parents see that more as we provide cultural experiences beyond the classroom setting for our children. And parents in the United States complain about the amount of homework that children have. So I think that we ask too much of our teachers, and that's one of the reasons that we're having issues. But I would agree that we have a very creative educational system, so that we may not be able to read, recite, and regurgitate all the time as well as maybe other nations, but that we bring kind of innovative ways to the classroom when possible. And I think that if you look around what teachers in this room are talking about doing, that it speaks to the desire to innovate, and that desire to learn comes across to children, and so they learn in novel ways. So I haven't given up on us by any means, but I do think that it's much broader than just the technological kind of piece of the pie.
Okay, well, with that, I want to thank our panelists so much and thank the audience for their contributions to this panel. And I'm now going to turn it over to Ted Lempert for our closing remarks.
Well, thank you, Vicky, and thank you, panel. And don't worry, we don't need any clapping exercises. I'll be very, very brief, and you'll get to go to these in just a minute. But I do just want to quickly make a couple closing comments and some thank yous. And Laura Cassis-Fry, one of our other children board members who joined us later today, I was telling her, I said, well, I'm going to try to soak this all in and then give a couple closing comments, which I should have never tried to do, because my own close reaction is, wow. But, my first thought is, my kids should have been here, because I wanted them to hear about the warnings. I wanted them to see especially that math presentation, especially for my sixth grader, and announcement. They will get to benefit, because we'll be sending you all out the links to all the presentations, and I'll make sure my kids see that. But then I thought, oh my goodness, how unhelpful a reaction is that? Because I lead a national organization that's working on these issues. We have 2 parents. There's food on the table tonight. There's computers at home, laptops at home, iPod. And so when we look at this issue, we need a reality check. I mean, just to California stats, half the kids in this state, and as go California goes the rest of the country, live in families that can't meet the basics. Half. Over 40% single-parent families. Over 30% don't speak English. Other reality check, and I think the reference was made by a principal here about the joke about having lunch. I mean, most teachers are like, do I have a chance to go to the restaurant? The public employees who work at the VA, who work at the Pentagon, who work at health services, who work at welfare, don't buy their own supplies. Teachers do. So reality check of how difficult this is. And I think, Craig really nailed it when we talked about the complexity of what we're dealing with. However, I do think what we heard today, and especially all the inspiring stories, is how we need to figure out a way to take some of these great ideas to scale, even despite the complexity of what we're facing. And we have to look especially at what are the barriers to some of the great things we saw today. And just 2 quick frames which have come up throughout the day. One, taking it to scale by working with private industry. And there are examples of nonprofits working with for-profits when the nonprofits have no financial connection with those for-profits, but can share with them the needs of kids and try to encourage the for-profits where they can make money doing it, but there's a judge from the nonprofit community monitoring them. And I think there's a huge opportunity for that private sector collaboration here, where there's lots of companies producing this stuff, but there hasn't been the connection made to how to make sure the stuff that's best for kids get into the classroom, get into the home, get into the after-school programs. And the second is policy, and as was noted, this is not the kind of issue where some member of Congress or state legislator can just, here's the Technology and Education Act of 2009, and we've solved the problem. In fact, one of the most powerful things that we heard today was how some of the coolest stuff happened by accident in the classroom. And folks in Washington, D.C. and state capitals aren't real good at legislating things that can happen by accident. Sometimes they make the accidents. But we did hear some specifics, certainly the research, and I think that some interesting ideas that came out today is there's a lot of focus in the media world through camera and other efforts where we sort of talk about media research, and then we've got the Department of Education over here in connecting some of those champions we've had in the U.S. Senate and connecting some of those issues together. We need one thing that I didn't hear as much today, but I think there were snippets, were barriers that exist today, not just at the federal level, but you think of the publisher contracts that exist throughout this country, where there's barriers to this kind of technology being in the classroom, and some policy levers that can be made there, and some incentives, maybe freedom from a lot of these regulations that the feds and states push down if there's progress shown on technology. But the other key, and I think we all benefited from this today, is just recognizing the importance of this issue and the enormity of this issue, is we need to make sure our policymakers understand what's going on out there, for at the very least, so they're not enacting policies that do harm, that create more barriers, which is a great fear I think we have. And I don't think a lot of policymakers understand what we have all had a chance to understand today and understand in our work. And I think that's, and that's critical. And something I know we at Children Now are real interested in, which takes me to a couple thank yous. I want to thank Eileen again, who just did a tremendous job with this conference, and then congratulations. And then other Children Now staff who are here, Jeff McIntyre was referenced, who leads our efforts in D.C. I recognized Wilma Chan earlier, our VP of Policy, Ronald Pineda, our communications specialist, and Betty May and Catherine Washburn Main were also here today helping out, and it's Betty's birthday, so thank you very much for spending your birthday. At least we got you lunch, Betty. And to thank the Future of Children for co-sponsoring this in Stanford, and all the folks that participated. And the last thought, someone mentioned earlier that we were in this for the long haul, and that's true, although I think what concerns me most about this general issue of technology and media and education is we do need to hurry out. Because my concern is, as we talk about taking things to scale, making sure 50 million kids can benefit and their education system connects them to the world that they live in today, that we don't take 50, 60 years figuring out a way to take these to scales, because by then, the conference 67 years from now, just as we referenced the agrarian and industrial revolution, we're going to be on to something different, and a couple of generations of kids are going to miss out on what a lot of kids have benefited due to the expertise in this room. So we need to be careful, recognize the complexity, but there's a lot of brain power in this room, a lot of great experience, and I think we've had a super discussion that can help set us forward to move smartly, but also move quickly. So we really do give all kids a chance to benefit and reach their full potential. So thank you very, very much for coming today, and hopefully, in addition to learning a lot, you've made connections that can help folks work together as we move forward on this important issue. Thank you very much.